So far in this program, we've been talking about sentences. Now I'm about to introduce a new word for a reason which will soon become apparent. This new word is clause. And here's the definition. A clause is a group of words that includes both a subject and a verb. Now you may be thinking, gee, that sounds an awful lot like a sentence, because after all the sentences we've looked at up to this point do contain both subjects and verbs. So how is a clause different from a sentence? Well, that will become obvious in a moment. Let me explain that there are two kinds of clauses. One of them is the same as a sentence, and the other is not. But it's important to understand both kinds of clauses because larger and more complicated sentence structures may involve both kinds of clauses. Here's how it works. The first kind of clause is an independent clause. An independent clause is one that can stand alone as a sentence. Why? Because it expresses a complete thought. You know the word independent means able to stand on one's own. When the United States became independent from the country that founded it, England, the United States was able to stand on its own, and an independent clause can stand on its own as a sentence. Take a look at this example. Europa is one of the moons of Jupiter. Now, this is a clause because it's a group of words that contains both a subject and a verb. Can you identify the subject and the verb in this sentence? The subject is Europa. Europa is what the sentence is about. The verb is. That is what Europa is or does in this sentence. It is something. And the rest of the words tell us what Europa is, one of the moons of Jupiter. So this is a clause because it contains both a subject and a verb. It's also a sentence because this happens to be an independent clause, a clause that is able to stand alone as a sentence because it expresses a complete thought. Well, if an independent clause can stand alone as a sentence, what do you call a clause that cannot stand alone as a sentence? The answer is a subordinate clause. The word subordinate means following or less important than, and this describes what these clauses are like. A subordinate clause can't stand alone as a sentence because it doesn't express a complete thought. Usually, subordinate clauses begin with particular types of words which are known as subordinating conjunctions. A conjunction is a word that connects two groups of words, and the word subordinating means making something less important. So a subordinating conjunction is a word that connects the subordinate clause to the rest of the sentence and makes the subordinate clause less important. Because the subordinating conjunction is present, the subordinate clause can't stand alone as a sentence. Here are some examples of subordinating conjunctions. If, after, because, since, although, when, until. Normally, a clause that begins with one of these words, one of these subordinating conjunctions, can't stand alone as a sentence because it won't express a complete thought. Therefore, we consider it a subordinate clause. Take a look at this example. Because Europa has oceans filled with water like the earth. Now, this is a clause because it does contain a subject and a verb. The subject is Europa. The verb is has. So far, so good. But can this stand alone as a sentence? No. I think if you listen to this group of words, you can see that the clause doesn't express a complete thought. It says, because Europa has oceans filled with water like the earth. This leaves you wondering what the speaker is getting at. Because Europa has oceans filled with water, therefore what? We're waiting for some conclusion. It sounds as though the sentence is leading to some conclusion, but none is presented. And therefore, this isn't a complete sentence. Rather, it's a subordinate clause, one that cannot stand alone as a sentence. And if this were to appear in a piece of writing as if it were a complete sentence, that would be a mistake. This is really a sentence fragment. This is a subordinate clause because it begins with the subordinating conjunction because. Notice that having the subordinating conjunction because there makes this into a subordinate clause. If you were to take away that subordinating conjunction, the sentence would become an independent clause. It could stand alone as a sentence. The sentence would then say, Europa has oceans filled with water like the earth. Now that sounds like a complete thought. But when you put the subordinating conjunction because in front of it, it makes the clause less important. It makes it feel as though it needs to be attached to something else in order to express a complete thought. So this is the second type of clause. An independent clause can stand alone as a sentence. A subordinate clause cannot. And a subordinate clause usually begins with a subordinating conjunction. Now, why is it important to know about subordinate clauses? Because subordinate clauses are an important building block in many sentences. In fact, there are 4 different kinds of sentence structures that you need to know about, and subordinate clauses are important in some of them. The 4 types of sentence structures that you need to understand are the simple sentence, the compound sentence, the complex sentence, and the compound complex sentence. Let's take a look at each. First, a simple sentence. A simple sentence consists of one independent clause. Remember, an independent clause can stand alone as a sentence, and when it does, the result is what we call a simple sentence. For example, life may exist on Europa. This simple sentence contains the subject, life, the verb, which has 2 words, may exist, and taken together it is one clause, one independent clause, and therefore a simple sentence. By contrast, a compound sentence contains 2 or more independent clauses, which are joined either by a comma and a coordinating conjunction or a semicolon. That's a complicated definition, so let's take it piece by piece. A compound sentence contains 2 or more independent clauses. As we've seen, an independent clause can stand alone as a sentence, but 2 of them can also be joined together to form a compound sentence. Now, when you have 2 independent clauses and you want to join them together, you have to do it according to certain rules. And there are basically 2 alternatives, 2 ways of making that connection. One way of making the connection is by using a comma and a coordinating conjunction. There are a few different words that are called coordinating conjunctions. The most important and common ones are and, or, and but. So one way of joining 2 independent clauses to create a compound sentence is by using a comma and the word and, or but. Another way of connecting 2 independent clauses to make a compound sentence is by using a semicolon in between them. Let's take a look at an example of a compound sentence. Many astronomers believe in extraterrestrial life, but others disagree. Here we have 2 independent clauses which have been joined together to form a single compound sentence. The first independent clause is, many astronomers believe in extraterrestrial life. The word extraterrestrial means life outside of this planet, outside of the Earth. That could stand alone as a sentence. It's an independent clause. It contains the subject, astronomers, and the verb believe, and it could stand alone as a sentence. Then we have the clause, but others disagree. That could also stand alone as a sentence. It contains the subject others, the verb disagree, and the word but tells you that there's a contrast to the preceding idea. Nonetheless, it could stand alone as a sentence. It's perfectly all right to begin a sentence with a word like but or and. In any case, this is another independent clause. So this could have been set up as 2 separate sentences. But because the ideas are closely connected, the writer wanted to link them. How did he do it? By using a comma and the coordinating conjunction but. Putting that comma and the word but in there makes it easy to connect the 2 clauses to form one sentence. namely a compound sentence, because it's made up of two independent clauses. Now remember, we said there's another way of creating a compound sentence, and that is to use a semicolon in place of the comma and the coordinating conjunction. So this sentence would also be correct if it read as follows. Many astronomers believe in extraterrestrial life, semicolon. Others disagree. This would also be a correct way of creating this compound sentence. The point, a compound sentence consists of two independent clauses, and there are two alternative ways of joining them to make a single sentence. So that's our second type of sentence, simple sentence and a compound sentence. Now for the third type. A complex sentence contains an independent clause and one or more subordinate clauses. Now remember, the subordinate clause cannot stand alone as a sentence. However, it works perfectly well when it is attached to an independent clause. It normally has a secondary or less important meaning, and it needs the independent clause in order to express a complete thought. Let's take a look at an example of how this works. Here's a sentence. If extraterrestrial life is ever discovered, it will change human history. Now here we have two clauses. The first clause says, if extraterrestrial life is ever discovered. The subject of this clause is life. The verb is discovered. It's a two-word verb, and in this case, the word ever happens to come in between the two parts of the verb. That happens sometimes. So the subject and the verb is life is discovered, and the whole clause reads, if extraterrestrial life is ever discovered. Now let's pause. Is that an independent clause or a subordinate clause? Could it stand alone as a sentence? Well, think about how it sounds. If extraterrestrial life is ever discovered. Doesn't it leave you hanging? It leaves you wondering what the author is building toward. It sounds as though some conclusion is necessary. Therefore, we don't have a complete thought. We do have a subordinate clause. This is a clause that can't stand alone as a sentence. Let's take a look at the other clause and see what that is like. The other clause reads, it will change human history. This is a clause because it contains a subject and a verb. The subject is it, and will change is the verb. It will change human history. Now, could this clause stand alone as a sentence? Yes, it could. It expresses a complete thought. It will change human history. That could be a sentence by itself. So this is an independent clause. In this case, therefore, we have a subordinate clause first, followed by an independent clause. The two things work together to create a single, complete thought. If extraterrestrial life is ever discovered, it will change human history. The first clause sets up a possibility, and the second clause explains what would happen if that possibility comes true. So the two clauses work together to express one complete idea. And therefore we have a correct sentence which is known as a complex sentence, because that's what a complex sentence does. It combines two different kinds of clauses, one an independent clause and the other a subordinate clause, makes them into a whole to express a single thought. Notice that it doesn't matter what order the clauses are in. The subordinate clause could come first, or the independent clause could come first. In this particular sentence, the subordinate clause comes first, but it could have been the other way around. Either way, it's considered a complex sentence. The fourth and most difficult kind of sentence is known as the compound complex sentence. The compound complex sentence contains two or more independent clauses and one or more subordinate clauses. So it's like a combination of the compound sentence with the complex sentence. As you can see, the compound complex sentence must have at least three clauses. And some writers in English, William Faulkner is a famous novelist who is a good example of this. Some writers in English write sentences that go on for many, many words, and in some cases even a page or more. And some of the sentences in William Faulkner contain 10 or 12 or more separate clauses. Those are very complicated sentences, and their grammar is very difficult to untangle. But a compound complex sentence must contain at least 3 clauses. Let's take a look at an example and we'll see how this works. Although no sign of life on other worlds has yet been found, the search continues and many predict success. In this sentence, we have 3 groups of words, and each of these 3 is a clause because each contains a subject and a verb. Let's take a look at each one. The first group of words says, although no sign of life on other worlds has yet been found. This is a clause because it contains a subject and a verb. The verb actually happens to be 3 words long. Has been found is the complete verb. You need all 3 words to make up the verb in this case. The word yet, which is stuck in the middle, happens to be an adverb. And adverbs do sometimes interrupt verbs in this way. But that isn't an important detail for right now. The verb is has been found, and the subject is sign. Sign has been found is the heart of this clause. Now, looking at the clause as a whole, is it an independent clause or a subordinate clause? Could it stand alone as a sentence? Well, the answer is no, it couldn't. Read it again. Although no sign of life on other worlds has yet been found. Perhaps you can hear that something is missing. The author seems to be building up to some conclusion, but no conclusion is presented. We can't tell what is supposed to happen as a result of the fact that no sign of life on other worlds has yet been found. We feel as though we're left hanging. Therefore, this clause doesn't express a complete thought, so it's a subordinate clause. The telltale sign, of course, is that it begins with a subordinating conjunction, although. Almost always, a clause that begins with the word although will be a subordinate clause and unable to stand alone as a sentence. What about the second clause? The next group of words in the sentence reads, the search continues. Here again we have a subject and a verb. The verb is continues and the subject is search. Could this stand alone as a sentence? Yes, it could. It expresses a complete thought. It sounds complete. And although it only consists of 3 words, nonetheless, it would make up a complete sentence by itself and could stand alone. The search continues. So here we have an independent clause. What about the last group of words in the sentence? And many predict success. Once again, this is a clause because it has a subject and a verb. The verb is predict, and the subject is many. Could this stand alone as a sentence? And many predict success. Yes, it could. This expresses a complete thought, and it could stand alone as a sentence. So now let's step back and look at what we have. We have a sentence consisting of 3 clauses. The first one is a subordinate clause. The second one is an independent clause. And the third one is another independent clause. That's what makes this a compound, complex sentence. Notice that the sentence is not terribly long or terribly complicated to understand. You probably didn't find it very difficult to understand what was being said in the sentence. Nonetheless, this is about as complicated from a grammatical standpoint as a sentence can get. Of the 4 types of sentences, the compound complex sentence is the most complicated type. So if you understand how this sentence is put together, you have a pretty good chance of understanding how any and all sentences are put together. The only difference when you get to a sentence written by someone like William Faulkner is that more and more clauses are piled on. But it just continues to be more of the same kind of thing, more of a compound complex sentence with more and more independent and subordinate clauses added on. Notice that as we've discussed these 4 types of sentences, the simple sentence, the compound sentence, the complex sentence, and the compound complex sentence, we've seen certain rules that apply to your own writing and to any academic work that you do related to English or grammar. We've seen that it's a mistake to let a subordinate clause stand alone as a sentence. When you do that, you create a sentence fragment, which is considered a grammatical error. Here's another type of grammatical error to watch out for. It's called the run-on sentence. Now, what is a run-on sentence? Many people think, from the name of this error, that a run-on sentence is a sentence that is simply too long. Perhaps they figure that a sentence that's more than 50 words, let's say, is a run-on sentence? Well, a run-on sentence really has nothing to do with the length. There's a very simple definition of a run-on sentence, which should make it easy for you to avoid it in your own writing. A run-on sentence includes two or more independent clauses that are joined only by a comma or by nothing at all. Now let's stop and remember how we defined a compound sentence. Remember, a compound sentence contains two or more independent clauses. But when we discussed the compound sentence, we saw that there were two appropriate ways of connecting the two independent clauses. One way would be to use a comma and a coordinating conjunction, such as and, or but. The other correct way would be to use a semicolon. A run-on sentence comes about when two independent clauses are taken and simply jammed together with no punctuation between them, or perhaps just a comma. Doing that makes an incorrect sentence. It's a run-on. The connection between the two independent clauses is not clear, and it's considered a grammatical error. So if you have a teacher who says, you've made a mistake in your paper by writing a run-on sentence, this is what the teacher means. And you can see that the way to correct it is by following the proper rules for creating a compound sentence. Here's an example of a run-on sentence. Visit the City Science Museum. You'll see some fascinating exhibits about outer space. Here we have two clauses. Visit the City Science Museum. That's an independent clause, and it could stand alone as a sentence. Then we have another clause. You'll see some fascinating exhibits about outer space. What's the subject and the verb in each of these clauses, by the way? The first clause may be a little bit tricky. It has a verb, visit, but the subject doesn't appear. This is an imperative clause, namely one that is giving you an order or a recommendation or a suggestion. And the subject doesn't appear normally in an imperative sentence. The subject is understood to be you. What this clause is saying is you visit the City Science Museum. So an imperative sentence is an exception to our rule that a subject and a verb must always appear. In an imperative sentence, the subject may be understood. In our second clause, the subject is you, and the verb is will see. In this case, it takes the form of the contraction apostrophe LL instead of spelling out the word will at full length. But the words you'll see really mean the same as you will see. So in the second clause here, the verb is will see, and the subject is you. So we have two clauses here, either one of which could stand alone as a sentence. Look at that second clause. You'll see some fascinating exhibits about outer space. That could stand alone as a sentence. We have two independent clauses which have simply been stuck together with a comma in between. That's what makes this wrong. It's a run-on sentence. If you had written this in your own paper, you would have to correct it to make the paper grammatically acceptable. What would be a good way to fix this run-on sentence? Well, you have at least two options. Remember our rules about how to create a compound sentence. One way to correct this would be to use a comma and a coordinating conjunction. And in this case, the coordinating conjunction and seems like the natural choice. So the sentence would be correct if it read, visit the City Science Museum, comma, and you'll see some fascinating exhibits about outer space. Another way to correct the run-on sentence would be to substitute a semicolon for the comma. Then the sentence would read, visit the City Science Museum, semicolon, you'll see some fascinating exhibits about outer space. That would also be correct. There's another program in this series that deals with punctuation, and we'll talk in more detail about the semicolon in that program. But for now, here's an important tip to remember. The purpose of the semicolon, basically, is to connect independent clauses. So whenever you use a semicolon in your writing, what appears on either side of the semicolon should be an independent clause, able to stand alone as a sentence. And if you put a semicolon in the middle of this longer sentence, you would create a correct compound sentence. The problem with it as it now reads is that it's a run-on because the two independent clauses have simply been stuck together with a comma, which does not work. Of course, there's really a third possible solution, which would be to make the two independent clauses into two separate sentences. Put a period in between and put a capital letter at the beginning of the second sentence, and you'd be fine. So a run-on sentence can easily be corrected, but you must remember the rules for properly creating a compound sentence. To reinforce the skills and the topics we've just been discussing, we have one more exercise in your study guide. In this exercise, you were asked to read several sentences, and for each one to decide whether it was a simple sentence, a compound sentence, a complex sentence, or a compound complex sentence. In addition, we threw in one run-on sentence for you to notice. Remember that a run-on sentence is an error, something you would need to correct if you wrote one in your own writing. Let's take a look at the first sentence in the exercise. Jazz is the greatest American musical form, and Duke Ellington is its greatest genius. Here we have two clauses, and both are independent clauses. Either of these could stand alone as a sentence. Jazz is the greatest American musical form. That could stand alone as a sentence. Duke Ellington is its greatest genius. That too could stand alone as an independent sentence. Therefore, we have two independent clauses which have been properly and correctly combined by using a comma and the word and. Therefore, we have a compound sentence in this case. Let's look at our second example. Although young women want to participate in sports as much as young men, women's sports often don't receive equal funding from colleges. Here we have a slightly longer sentence, but it's still fundamentally not too complicated. It really consists of just two clauses. Let's break it down into parts and analyze each one. The first clause is everything before the comma, and it reads, although young women want to participate in sports as much as young men. What's the verb in this particular clause? What word expresses action or being on the part of the subject? The verb is want, and the subject is women. Young women is the broader subject, but the simple subject is women. So the subject and verb in this clause is women want, and everything else in the clause is there to provide more information about what kind of women we're talking about and what specifically they want. Now, looking at that clause as a whole, could it stand alone as a sentence? The answer is no. It's a subordinate clause. It couldn't stand alone as a sentence, and again, there's a telltale sign. It begins with the subordinating conjunction, although. When you read this clause, you can see that something more is needed to make a complete thought. Although young women want to participate in sports as much as young men, therefore what? We don't know, and so by itself, this would not work as a complete sentence. Notice that although there are a lot of words there, it would still make a sentence fragment. So the word fragment doesn't necessarily mean a short or small number of words. It simply means that the words do not express a complete thought and therefore cannot stand alone as a sentence. So we have here a subordinate clause in the first part of this sentence. What about the second part of the sentence? Women's sports often don't receive equal funding from colleges. Here we have an independent clause. This could stand alone as a complete sentence. Don't receive is the verb, and sports, or women's sports, more broadly, is the subject. This could stand alone as a sentence, so it's an independent clause. So we have here a subordinate clause linked to an independent clause. The two ideas together make one complete thought, and therefore we have a complex sentence. Our third example reads, the tallest mountain in Africa, Mount Kilimanjaro, is the subject of a stunning new IMAX documentary film. Now, the first group of words in this sentence doesn't happen to be a clause. The sentence begins, the tallest mountain in Africa. Remember that a clause has to contain both a subject and a verb. Is there a verb here, a word expressing action or being? Not really. We simply have what could be a subject, the tallest mountain in Africa, but there's no verb there. So this is not a clause. It's a modifying phrase, again, a term that's not important for this conversation, but it's simply giving more information about what appears in the real clause, which is about to begin. Mount Kilimanjaro is the subject of a stunning new IMAX documentary film. Here is where the verb appears. Is the verb, and the simple subject is Mount Kilimanjaro. So in this case, this sentence consists of simply one clause, one independent clause, which is able to stand alone as a sentence. So this is a simple sentence. Again, notice the term simple sentence doesn't necessarily mean that the sentence is very short. There are quite a few words here, but because there's only one clause, it's a simple sentence. Our next example. The author Mark Twain was fascinated by technology. He was the first writer ever to deliver a typed manuscript to his publisher. Here we have two separate clauses, and both of them happen to be independent clauses. Either one could stand alone as a sentence. You can probably tell just by reading them. The author Mark Twain was fascinated by technology. We have a subject and a verb, and this could stand alone as a complete thought. He was the first writer ever to deliver a typed manuscript to his publisher. Here again we have a subject and a verb, and it could stand alone as a complete thought. We have two independent clauses then. Does that mean we have a compound sentence? No, because the rules for how you create a compound sentence have not been followed. The two independent clauses have simply been stuck together with a comma. So what do we have? We have a run-on sentence, and this is an error. It would have to be corrected either by adding a coordinating conjunction, such as and, or but, or by substituting a semicolon for the comma in the middle of the sentence. In this case, using a semicolon would probably make the most sense, since and, or but do not work particularly well as connecting words in this sentence. Instead, using a semicolon to turn this into a proper compound sentence would be a good way of correcting the run-on sentence. It would then read, the author Mark Twain was fascinated by technology, semicolon. He was the first writer ever to deliver a typed manuscript to his publisher. And that would be correct. Our last sentence reads, when I visited California last summer, I spent 1 week in San Francisco, and I visited the nearby Napa Valley with my cousin. Here we have three clauses. The first one, when I visited California last summer, is a subordinate clause. Perhaps you can tell that it can't stand alone as a sentence. It leaves us wondering what happened when I visited California last summer. It sounds incomplete, and it is. It is a subordinate clause and can't stand alone as a sentence. The next clause reads, I spent 1 week in San Francisco. This is an independent clause. It could stand alone as a sentence. The last clause reads, I visited the nearby Napa Valley with my cousin. Again, it's another independent clause, and it could also stand alone as a sentence. So in this case, we have a subordinate clause followed by two independent clauses. What kind of sentence does this make? A compound, complex sentence. So this shows exactly how these different types of sentences work, and I think you can see that combining independent with subordinate clauses in various ways gives you the flexibility to bring together in a single sentence ideas that are related to one another or that belong together and that add up to a complete whole. And the more practice you have in writing in English, the better you'll get at using each of these four different types of sentences appropriately in order to express increasingly complex ideas. Well, that concludes our discussion of sentence structure. You've learned about the basic parts of any sentence, about the most common types of sentences, and you've also learned about the errors that you need to avoid when constructing a sentence properly in order to earn high grades on papers that you might write for school, as well as to express yourself effectively and correctly in any writing that you do on the job or in any other life situation. I hope you found this program to be helpful, and you're invited to view the other programs in Video-Aided Instructions English Grammar Series in order to further strengthen your comfort level with the complexities of English grammar. Thank you for watching, and good luck in your future endeavors.